different plants, most of which went to the war effort. But to fill these factories, people came from across the country. They came from Appalachia, but large numbers of African Americans came up from the South. And when they got here, they found a city with established racial patterns enforced by restrictive covenants on deeds, enforced by redlining patterns on lending, enforced by everyday racism that made blacks uncomfortable moving into any white neighborhood. And the problem grew worse and worse as the same people who were building the arms to keep Europe free couldn't find a place to live. And so the federal government thought they had an idea. We'll build a whole new neighborhood for 200 families that'll be quality housing that will alleviate this pressure, and they built the Sojourner Truth Homes. Sounded like a step in the right direction, except when it came time to move in, people from the surrounding neighborhoods said, we don't want black families living this close to us. Came out in protest, and the city of Detroit, having actually built this for the black families, said, no black families allowed. And they flipped it. They absolutely said, this is going to be for white families. The champion of this, interestingly enough, when the leadership in the city of Detroit came forward, they went to the First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt had always been a champion for the elimination of discrimination in housing. She was actually at the Brewster Center when it opened, providing quality black housing for African Americans in Detroit. And when she heard that this development was going to exclude African Americans, she went to the president and the rest of the federal government, raised hell, and, amazing thing, Franklin Roosevelt, the federal government, flipped their position and said, we are going to have black families here. And when the first black families went to move in, the protest from the surrounding white areas was such that it took National Guard to move families who were working to build the arsenal of democracy, to move them into quality housing. That's the kind of discrimination that was faced, and it's the kind of history we cannot forget. And as Jamon Jordan said to you, it's the reason we celebrated the Burwood Wall, which was constructed at the direction of the federal government to formally establish redlining for housing before the FHA would lend money to build new homes. They had to be promised no blacks would move in. And as Jamon mentioned, not only is the Ocean Suite house being renovated, I'm going to be taking a city council proposal to spend another $1 million for the other houses across the street, so we can preserve that block of Garland as it looked in 1925 when the crowd gathered outside the house of the Sweet family had to defend themselves out of fear for their lives. We are celebrating what had to be overcome, because it'll always be a part of our history. And so, Jamon, you have done such a great job in raising this. I want to say thank you to the State Historic Preservation Office that's gotten this on the National Historic Registry. Thank you for your commitment to this and for everybody that made today possible. With that, I'll turn it back to our leader, our historian, Jamon Jordan.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. So when we're talking about this history and why it's important, again, as I stated, you can't move forward without understanding this history. There's an African concept called Sankofa. And Sankofa, the rough meaning in the Twi language of the Ashanti people is to go back and fetch it. But what it really means is that you can't move forward without knowing this history. Just as if you have a chronic illness and you go to the doctor, the first thing they want to do before they treat you is know your medical history, because they might do something that makes you worse. They need to know your medical history. You can't get healed unless you know this history. That's what history does. And so those states and those cities and those places in this country that are trying to block this history from being taught, they are not in a mood to heal this issue. And so if we're going to move forward as a country, as a state, and as the city of Detroit, we have to be ready to understand this history. We have to be able to understand the history of the Underground Railroad in the city of Detroit and how people had to fight against slavery. We have to be able to understand the history of housing discrimination, whether it was racial restrictive covenants and deeds, whether it was a wall being built to separate an African American neighborhood from a white development, from housing projects that were built for African Americans, but even when they were built for African Americans, there were people in the white community who wanted to stop them from being built. We have to understand all of that history or we can't move forward, because we have moved forward from understanding this history. The people who were activists in the 1920s were looking back to the Reconstruction period, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, that fight. The people in the 1940s, when this was built, and they were activists fighting for this to be able, for African Americans to be able to live here, they were looking back at the 20s and the Dr. Ocean Sweet case and those kinds of issues. The people in the 1950s and 60s were looking back at the 40s and seeing what were they doing, because Detroit is part of the model for what we know as the Civil Rights Movement. You know the Civil Rights Movement mainly as the 1950s and 60s in the South, in Selma, in Montgomery, in Mississippi. But a lot of those lessons were learned right here in the city of Detroit. We've learned some of these lessons already. The federal government sending the National Guard to guard African Americans to be able to move into this place. You saw that play out in the 1950s, in 1957 at Little Rock, Arkansas. You saw it, and you might have thought that was the first time it happened. Maybe you thought it was when John F. Kennedy nationalized the the National Guard in Mississippi so that UMISS could be integrated. Maybe you thought that was the first time. Maybe you thought when they were walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge from Selma to Montgomery and that the National Guard was guarding these marchers after they had been attacked on Bloody Sunday. Maybe you thought that was the first time that the federal government was being used against local racist policy. But right here in the city of Detroit, when this was built, and African Americans couldn't move in on February 28, 1942. When they move in on April 29, 1942, that is because the National Guard is guarding these African Americans. It had already been done in the city of Detroit. And when we talk about the Civil Rights Movement by the 1960s, the Detroit Walk to Freedom, we just celebrated it, the 60th anniversary of the Detroit Walk to Freedom, when Martin Luther King Jr. would give a portion of the I Have a Dream speech right here in the city of Detroit before he gave it in Washington, D.C. We celebrated that. And you know that this story, you know that the union was involved, the UAW, Walter P. Reuther. You know that political leaders were involved, both on the state level and the city itself. Well, you know that in 1963, but here in the city of Detroit in the 1940s, you see the union was involved with Reverend Charles Hill, Reverend Horace White of Plymouth Congregational, and Reverend Charles Hill was of Hartford Avenue Baptist Church. You see these activists, Calvary Baptist Church organized part of the protest to get these homes restated for African Americans. So you got black churches involved. You may attach that to the Civil Rights Movement with Dr. King, but it already is happening here in the city of Detroit in the 1940s. You see the union involved. You may attach that to the 1960s with the March on Washington or the Detroit Walk to Freedom, but it's already happened in the city of Detroit in the 1940s. Detroit is one of the models for the movement of progress for African Americans. So civil rights, human rights has a place right here in the city of Detroit. You cannot move forward without looking back. And we in Detroit cannot be like some of the states and cities that are in this country that are trying to block and ban black history, trying to ban this history of fighting against racial inequality. We have to be better than that, because if we want to be better than that, we have to look at this history so that we can be a better city, a better state, and a better country. Thank you for listening to me. But I'm going to move forward with the program and bring up and bring up the director for the Michigan State for Historic Preservation, Ryan Shoemaker. Give it up for Ryan Shoemaker.
Thank you. I can't compete with your impassioned speech, so I just wanted to say thank you to Jamon Jordan and Rochelle Riley for inviting my office out for this dedication for the state marker for the Sojourner Truth Homes. It has been great to see so many people come out to have this to attend this event. The SHPO, as an office and as the officer, applauds the work that the Historic Designation Advisory Board has done, and the City of Detroit as a whole, as well as the City of Detroit Civil Rights Advisory Board, that does to continue to highlight these sites that are important to these sites, buildings, neighborhoods, and sites across the city that help tell the full story and the complete story, as the good, the bad, and the ugly, as it relates to civil rights. The Sojourner Truth Homes is one of those sites that is so critically important to telling that story for the city, for the state, and for the nation. It has been listed, and such it has been listed on the National Register of Historic Places as one such site. Having this marker allows anyone who visits this site to experience the history, know what had happened here over 80 years ago. And I would like to thank all the individuals and partners who had made this sign happen. And thank you.
Thank you. I want to also thank people who wanted to be here but are not here. Rochelle Riley, the director of the Office for Arts, Culture, and Entrepreneurship, and my boss, along with the mayor, who is not here. I want to thank her for her work in getting this together, getting this event happening together. Although she wanted to be here, she could not. Also, Councilman Scott Benson, we're in his district, but of course, this is council day, so he's in council right now. But he wanted to be here, but he couldn't be here because, of course, he is a council member in his council day. And Janice Chapman, who is with the Historic Designation Advisory Board, who, of course, was presenting to council today. So she is not here, but she would have liked to have been here as well. So I want to give it up to those people. And let's give a hand to those people who were part of this, but are not right here right now. Also, I saw a couple of members of the Civil Rights Advisory Board. We worked over a year on getting these sites becoming historic markers, becoming part of the National Register of Historic Places, becoming state historic sites. We worked alongside SHPO, alongside the Historic Destination Advisory Board of the City of Detroit, but folks in the community, I want us to wave our hands if you were a part of the Civil Rights Advisory Board. I know at least I see one right over there. Marsha, oh yep, there's David Head right there. So there were 14 of us, and of course we've lost some members who are no longer with us, but they're with us in spirit. But they worked, and we've got a number of these sites that are listed now on the National Register of Historic Places because of the applications that we wrote, including the Rosa Parks Flat, including New Bethel Baptist Church, including the Shrine of the Black Madonna, a number of historic sites, the Burwood Wall, WGPR, a number of sites that are now on the National Register of Historic Places because of the work we did before the pandemic. We worked and we met in those places to get these places talked about in the city of Detroit. So now that we've done that work, the next part of the job is for us in the city of Detroit to learn our own history. We've learned some of the history of other places, but we need to learn our own history. So what we're doing today is just part of a bigger movement to learn our own history. And I'm going to bring up to you the director of the Detroit Housing Commission to give remarks, because of course this is a housing development that is under the purview of the Detroit Housing Commission and has been since it was developed. And so I bring you Sandra Enriquez.
Thank you. Good morning, or good afternoon. First, I'd like to recognize people from the Detroit Housing Commission who are here. If you might wave your hands. And then I'd especially like to say thank you and to recognize the Continental Management who began managing this property for us on July 1st. And the work that they've done, and so you see some of the beautification that's been going on both inside, outside, and it will move inside as well. Everybody's talked about the history of this property, and I wanted to talk about the woman who it's named for instead. And we hear all sorts of things. What a remarkable life she led. This year is the 140th anniversary of her passing. She was born in the city of New York, or in the state of New York, to enslaved parents. But her first language that she learned was Dutch. She spoke 3 languages. And in fact, she had been sold 3 times because her former owners didn't understand the language she was speaking, and so they thought that she was not of value to them and sold them off. I do want to say the thing that struck me the most about her history, and I think for me it connects the dots of why this place may be named after her. She escaped to freedom in 1826. She ran to another owner's house, an abolitionist land, who took her in, granted her freedom. She's the woman who, she named herself Sojourner Truth. She was born Isabella Baumfree, Baumfree. She named herself Sojourner because a sojourn, as her faith taught her, was to travel, and she thought that God was calling her to travel around the nation to spread the word of faith and about what slavery was and how dehumanizing it was. She called herself last name of Truth because she felt that she was on this mission to speak the truth about what was happening and should happen in this country. She's the first black woman to successfully sue a white man back in years ago, and she sued him because someone sold her 5-year-old son into slavery after New York State passed the anti-slavery law. And she won. The battle took months, but she got her son back. She was a preacher, strong woman, and you might remember her for a speech that she gave at a conference, Ain't I a Woman? When she talked about a woman having muscles like a man, a woman having to do things that men sometimes have to do because men were not around. She wanted to talk about how a woman has a rightful place, whether she be black or white, but in this case, white women at the time were devalued. So imagine that black women were even less than. And so her whole notion was to say, I'm a woman, I'm a black woman, I have value. And that's the message that I take away from her life and why she's here. This place has value, it has historic value, it has a history, it has a place in our lives that we need to honor, that we need to remember, and we should never, ever forget. Thank you.
Thank you. So as I close it out, I just want us to, on one level, understand this troubling history of the city of Detroit, but also look at some of this history that has happened in the city of Detroit that has moved the nation forward. All right, so I want us to understand that history. When African Americans, as the mayor told us during the Great Migration, they're leaving the South and coming to the city of Detroit. Many of them are getting jobs in the factories that are now doing work for the war effort. And they're getting those jobs, they're working in these factories, and as they're getting these jobs and working in these factories, there are issues that confront them. They leave the South, which is Southern Jim Crow. Racial, they are sharecroppers and tenant farmers. They can't vote. It's violent. It's lynchings every day somewhere in a southern state. And they come to the city of Detroit where black people can vote. They're not sharecroppers and tenant farmers, but housing discrimination exists. The schools are unequal. There's police brutality, so they're facing the northern version of Jim Crow. And many of the fights on that front happened right here in the city of Detroit. So if you're talking about the 1920s, when racial restrictive covenants are the major form of housing discrimination, the Dr. Ocean Sweet case, the 1920s is fighting against housing discrimination. Along with his defending his home, it's a housing discrimination fight that goes to the national level. People all over the country know this story. When it comes to homes, which we now call housing projects, one of the first is the Brewsters that are built in 1935. And as the mayor told us, Eleanor Roosevelt is there at the groundbreaking ceremony. The first families move in 1938. Of course, the most famous members of residents of that housing development are Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and Diana Ross, the Supremes. And then if we're talking about overturning racial restrictive covenants, Orson and Minnie McGee will buy a home at 4626 Seaboard on the west side. And there was a racial restrictive covenant in the deed. They're sued by neighbors, and I'm using the word neighbor in quotes. They're sued by them. This will go all the way up to the Supreme Court. Their attorney is Thurgood Marshall. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules that racial restrictive covenants cannot be enforced by the government. using the federal government to fight against local racist policies, which will be a staple of the 1960s, 1950s, and 1960s civil rights movement by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the NAACP, and the Congress of Racial Equality. But they're doing what has already been done, and a lot of that stuff that's already been done was done here in the city of Detroit. So I want to thank you all for coming and just getting a bit of this history today, just a little bit of snippet of this history, and I'm inviting you to dive deep into Detroit's history, both the great things that we have produced and the troubling history that the city had to go through, so that we can move forward and bring our city forward, bring our state forward, and bring this country forward. You can't move forward without looking back. Thank you all for listening to us today. Thank you all for being here. And although it is time to end the program, I'm going to stick around because I know some people have questions and things like that, but I'm going to stick around. But the mayor has other things he has to attend to, including a whole city, but I'll stick around to answer any questions. All right? Thank you. Okay.
Could you ask the solemn members to assemble? I want to get a group.
All right, real quick. Members of HDAB, raise your hand. I see some HDAB folks. Historic Designation Advisory Board folks, please raise your hand. All right. Members of ASALA, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, raise your hand. So these are other organizations and parts of the city that have worked to make this happen, all right, and to keep this history strong. Members of the Black Historic Sites Committee who are here, raise your hand. All right. You might be, and you are of course, a part of the Civil Rights Advisory Board. All right, so I know there's going to be a couple of photos.
Why don't you get your advisory board to come up here for the photos?
All right, Civil Rights Advisory Board members, David Head, Marsha, come on up.
Do we want to sit?
The people who were part of the Civil Rights Advisory Board when we were working on this. Yep,
I
come
love
on
what
up.
you're doing. This is great. It's important.
Everybody look straight ahead and smile. Look over here.
Right over here. Right over here, sir.
Look over, sir. Look right
Yep,
here.
right over here, sir. Right,
Looking
perfect.
at you.
There you go. Yeah. 3, 2, and 1. Perfect.
All right.
Yeah.
Never expected the city of Detroit was going to be the youngest of all of us.